Hi, I'm Susan from Sunrise Quilt Studio. In today's video I'm working on this slice quilt. It was made by Fancy Threads, which is an art quilters focus group of the Missouri River Quilt Guild. The pattern was made from a copyright-free Dover coloring book and sliced into 6 different sections. Each quilter took a section and made their section following a set of rules. And then the sections were sewn together to complete the top, and then the top was given to me to do the quilting. I started with stabilizing the quilt by quilting around each applique piece, and then I started the main quilting with the sky. Now the sky is quilted mostly with echo quilting, with a few swirls thrown in here and there for added movement. And I'm using the width of my hopping foot to be a guide as for how far apart I want these lines to be. And I started the sky using the lightest sections of the quilt and started with a lighter thread and quilted all of those sections, and then I moved to the next darkest section, changing my thread, and then I quilted those. And I used, altogether in this quilt, I used 15 different thread colors. And the biggest challenge for me in this quilt was being able to determine what areas were actually applique pieces of this quilt and which areas were different because the quilt had been sliced there. And in the lower section of that sky, I had quite a bit of trouble with that. I had to look back on a colored picture of the pattern to determine where the boundaries were, where the lines were between the applique pieces. And I wound up ripping that section out twice before I got it to the way I liked it. But it all turned out well, and I think it's a really pretty quilt. Now when I use a lot of thread changes in my quilts, I like to do all of the quilting with one thread, which means I wind up rolling the quilt up and down on the frame a couple of times before I get it all completed. I know some people like to just work on one section of the quilt, changing thread, and then they go to the next section of the quilt and change threads as they need to on that section. But with me, I think I spend more time changing bobbins and changing thread than I do rolling the quilt back and forth. So that's the way I work on art quilts for me, and even traditional quilts when I have to do a lot of thread changes. And it's all just personal preference on what you like to do. Now the echo quilting in this quilt, I think, gave the sky a lot of texture, and adding a few swirls in here and there gives it a little extra movement. And the way this pattern was, there was a lot of movement in it to begin with due to the different colors in the pattern in each different section of the sky. It's not just one solid background piece. Now some of the rules for this project were that no solid colored fabrics would be used. They'd all have to be batiks or prints or tone-on-tone fabrics. This is the second slice quilt that Fancy Threads has done, and the first quilt we did use some solid fabrics in it, and then we decided that it made the quilt look a little flat and we wanted a little bit more dimension in the quilt, so that's why we made that rule for that. And everything had to be hand appliqued with needle turn applique. We weren't going to be doing any raw edge or fusible applique in this quilt. So it turned out really well, and this quilt went together pretty easily, according to the quilter who stitched it all together for us. She said it was turned out a lot better than the first quilt that we did. So just takes a lot of practice. After the sky was done, I moved on to the heron, and I tried to keep in mind what direction the feathers would be lying on a bird. And I don't have a real good close-up of a real live heron, but for most birds, feathers will lie in a certain direction. So I started again with the darkest fabric and the darkest thread in this quilt, and that started on the head, and then I went down to the body of the quilt and worked on these feathers here. And what I'm doing is using an S-curve to give it the look of a bird's feathers. So I did an S-curve down and an S-curve up, and just kept working from top to bottom in each section of the quilt. And you'll notice here that I am not quilting a section of the applique and then moving on to the next. I'm quilting this all as one piece, and so the feathers are overlapping seam lines there, and I think that gives it a little bit more of a natural look. The only area where I did do things by sections is where the color was more of a drastic change. Like all of those purple sections have a purple thread in them, and then all of the dark sections have one color thread, and then there's a medium blue, and then there's a light blue, and each one of those sections has its own thread color in its section. So the bird actually went pretty fast. S-curves are pretty easy to do, and they don't take a whole lot of time. And here's another area where you can see where I am going over those seam lines and not worrying about keeping each section on its own. So it's just an S-curve down and an S-curve up, and keep working my way down that section there. And I have this machine on regulated mode, so I have the stitch regulator on, and I am stitching at about 11 stitches per inch. And right here I am manipulating the fabric just a little bit as I was working from left to right. There was a little bit of fullness there in that area, and this way I was able to work the fullness out without causing any puckers. So I had to slow down just a little bit there while I was quilting. Quilting with one hand, I have to slow down a little bit so that I can concentrate and control the machine a little bit better. And now I'm working from the bottom up. I wound up not having to cut thread any here in this section, which is always a time saver. I just working from the top to the bottom, and then the bottom up to the top. And just keep going until I get all of that dark section completed. Now this pattern was actually made for stained glass, so a lot of these pieces in the applique are kind of look like what you would see in a piece of stained glass. So it gives it a unique look. Now I'm working on the medium blue area, and also once again I am going over seam lines here just to give it more of a cohesive look. So that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If so, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and thanks for watching.